He's truly one of the culture's great ambassadors of visionary thinking these days. He's the co-author of the Pulitzer Prize nominated, Stealing Fire, and his more recent book, Colin had some copies over there if they haven't already gone. It's called Recapture the Rapture. And again, he's in the book over there, and maybe if there's some copies left, he'll sign a copy for you. And delighted to have him here, up from Austin, Texas, and his world travels, Jamie Wheal. Give him a big hand, please.
All right. Good morning, everybody. This is a super fun place to get to come, not only getting to see friends and colleagues like Dennis and Wade and a number of other folks presenting here, but also you guys are probably the freakiest, deakiest conference crowd I ever speak in front of, hence the trippiest fuck stage settings and everything else. So it's always fun to come up here. When I did in 2019, I was basically test driving the material for the next book I was writing, Recapture the Rapture, and then during lockdown, that's what I got to do. I was too busy traveling and everything from writing of Stealing Fire onwards had just been this kind of international magical mystery tour, and then finally the grace of being locked in the house actually allowed that book to get written. So I thought that I would kind of return to that theme and share with you today some of the themes for my next book, which is called The Story of How We Begin to Remember. And it's really attempting to try and tackle where we are at this particular moment in time, and how can we both take a clear-eyed look at what stories we're living, what stories serve, and how to find a path, a credible path, not just a jolly hockey sticks whistling past the graveyard path, right? But a path to radical hope, right? Stories that can serve and support we, in Joanna Macy's terms, the people of the passage. So with that, this will be probably, this is not as tight as it will be eventually when it's in print, right? But hopefully we can just kind of take a tour through some ideas, and we're still caffeinated. We haven't got lunch brain yet, so if we can bang on some of this, it'll be fun. All right, so if you will indulge me in this fun thought experiment, don't consider me a human, consider me an anthropologist from space. All right, so it's just this idea of like taking a look at humans on this earth and what a wacky tale it's been. Because if an anthropologist from space came down to earth and consulted all the best theologians, philosophers, scientists, right, and then prepared his or her report, what would it be? Yeah, this is what they might say. He would be like, hey guys, you're monkeys with clothes stuck on this little blue marble, and you've spent all of creation seeking novelty and trying to eat and heat starlight. That's it. The rest are details. All right, so this is going to be in 3 acts. And the first is just as we were speaking of already, what are the narrative structures? What are the stories that we live into? Because as anybody who is awake these days and scrolling through their news feeds, we're realizing we're in a place of not just existential crisis, but epistemic or narrative collapse. All of our old stories aren't working anymore, right? And people are clinging and striving for what is the way through. So I just want to kind of tee up. This was originally pioneered by Kurt Vonnegut, famously Cat's Cradle, Slaughterhouse-5 author. In his graduate work at the University of Chicago, he wrote his master's thesis on the shape of stories. He's like, hey man, like stories have shapes, kind of interesting. These are the questions that our stories attempt to answer, right? Doesn't this kind of seem about it? Where on earth have we come from? Like, what is our origin story? Because that gives us our roots, our lineage, and our purpose. What on earth? Situational assessment. What the hell is going on right now? And as a result of our answers to the first 2, what do we do now? So the first one, as you guys recognize well, is the rags to riches story. It's down then up. And the down then up story is typically, matches very well with the myth of progress. We once were naked apes living cold and dark in caves, then ta-da, 2001, and a femur bone and tools, fire, language, jets, and broadband Wi-Fi. Ta-da, right? And that one animated most of the 20th and early 21st centuries. It also pairs wonderfully with neoliberal capitalism, right? And you can see this tale, right? So keep working, work hard, and everything will get better. This is also Steven Pinker. This is the fodder of TED Talks, right? Everything is high and to the right, like George Bush back in the day. All right, so this is the pre-tragic story. This is the American dream. This is when you grow up, you can become an astronaut or a president, and you get to marry Prince Charming or Sleeping Beauty. It's very inspiring, right? And a little long in the tooth, a little threadbare at this point. Once we run out of being able to think that everything's going to work out, we run smack dab into the wound of the world. We run into the tragic. And that's where nothing is going to work out. Things started out well and have just gone downhill from there. If anybody's familiar with Yuval Harari and his book Sapiens, and a slew of other books these days, I think it's really, really interesting to note how many trot out the drumbeat of everything was peachy fucking keen until 10,000 years ago, agrarianism, patriarchy, animal husbandry, slavery, all the bad things, and we've been doomed ever since, right? This is also the East of Eden tale. This is original sin. This is we had it for some precious eternal moment, we lost it, and we kind of deserve what's coming. Right? And this is also the diseases of despair people are experiencing. By the way, this entire book, this entire talk is really dedicated to my son, right? Thoughtful fellow who's been exposed to many of these things, probably sooner than he had to, just because of the work we do in the world and the colleagues and peers we have. And I have to have better answers for him. I have to. I have to give an entire generation of people a reason to keep on keeping on. So this is very much a labor of love, but the tragic can crush us if we get stuck there. But Vonnegut noted that there was one story that was stickier than others, more satisfying than everything else. And it's this one. It's the Cinderella story. It's that things start out bad, right? Sweeping, ashes, crummy stepsisters, lousy stepmom. They get really good, right? Dancing with the prince, bibbidi bobbidi boo, right? Then they get super fucking bad, right? Stroke of midnight, lost slipper, all is lost, to the happiest ever after ever at the end. And if we locate ourselves in this story, we could say this is kind of a hybrid, right? We started out cold and shivering, living in caves. We ended up with technology progress, vaccines and smartphones. Stroke of midnight, literally, right? The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists putting us at 90 seconds to midnight. They probably poised to make that a minute to midnight, post-Ukraine, Russia instability, everything else. The worst it's been since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and now actually the worst it's been, period, on the risk of losing it all for potentially the greatest happily ever after ever. And I believe that, Chris, you'll be speaking to some of that from a very different perspective, right? But this notion of where do we find hope in the face of not just regressing from the tragic, regressing from the scary stuff, from the pain and the wounding, into a pre-tragic, fa-la-la, which, by the way, is also the domain of demagogues. Demagogues promise their people, promise their tribe, a return to the way it always was, great again, said Voldemort, who shall not be named. Because something happens when we move past the tragic, and it's a very rare move, but when it happens, it unleashes soul force in the world. This was Gandhi's term, satyagraha, the notion of truth and the potency of it. This was Howard Thurman, the civil rights scholar and mystic, who then influenced Martin Luther King with the notion of translating that to soul force. MLK says that in his 63 Washington speech, when we can meet physical force with soul force, right? When we can climb the majestic heights, we have something possible. And this is hopefully where we can source from, but only if we have stories that are durable, stories that are true, and somehow still can locate ourselves in a narrative across time and space and consciousness and causation bigger than our team is the best. Because those stories are crumbling. So you guys might not have heard of this, but Pixar, right, the folks who constantly crank out all those fantastic animated films, actually have a creative design process. And they make every single one of their films follow this story, which is once upon a time, so early steady state, then inciting incident, one day, something happens, right, upsets the apple cart. And then, progressive complications, until finally, ... resolution or transformation. So this is arguably our story right now. Once upon a time, bam, a bunch of clever primates figured out how to turn buried starlight, aka fossil fuels, into abundance, prosperity, and unprecedented population growth. But then, after a century or so of riding this rocket ship of progress, they slowly began to realize that none of it was sustainable and that they were heading towards an ecological, political, economic, and cultural crisis. A bunch of bad actors muddied the waters, and the political and business leaders conspired to keep the old way going for as long as possible, despite the blaring warning signs. And then they all went off the cliff without any skid marks. The global world order collapsed and life got medieval in a hurry. Only those communities that found hope were able to persist until one day, and this is the hat tip to Chris's investigations, right? Until one day humanity came all the way to its senses and stood up to defend goodness, truth, and beauty and all of life on earth. It was hard and slow going, but they finally created ways to thrive that reflected the best of their creativity and humanity. Does that feel about right? So now we got to do this thing, right? So that's the shape of stories. Which one are we in? Which one are we living? Which ones feel true, right? Which ones give us the space and the capacity and the wisdom to endure what we must, but also to hold on to and to cherish what we can. So now we're going to do this thing, which is the Anthropologist from Space assessment of what is the role of consciousness and evolution, at least on this little blue marble. Because this part's true, right? We done woke up and started thinking about ourselves. Yes. So these are some of the questions, especially as we're coming to the end of our old stories. Like, think how just busy we got with go to school, get good grades, go to the best college you can, get the best job you can, earn as much as you can, find the spouse, find the house, 2.2 kids, suburbs, golden rings, whatever you want to call it. Right? That just occupied so much bandwidth for like 75 years. Like post-World War II, it was the thing. And in fact, even the evolution of the American suburb in Levittown, right, was very specific. They said, this was a federal policy. They're like, it's going to be very unlikely. This is, remember, end of World War II, beginning of the Cold War, right, Red Scare. They're like, it's highly unlikely that a man with a job and a mortgage is going to be a communist. Crazy. You're like, just keep them busy, put them in debt, put them on the hamster wheel. It's a great way to manage a population. So when we ask what is the meaning of life, right, we're at the end of our old stories, the simple flat ones, the material acquisitive ones. What might the meaning of life be? I think it's fair to say that evolution is amoral. If you just look at human imprinting and sex drives alone, you think of infidelity, you think of sexual violence, you think of jealousy, you think of all the angst that we experience as humans. Evolution doesn't give a fuck about our vows, right? About our happily ever afters. All it wants is a robust gene pool. That's it. And all of the hormonal drivers, incentives, and impulses are just at odds with our cherished human values. But it's not just sexuality. Sexuality is one subset of the novelty engine. Right? But once we understand that, other things shake out. What is the problem of evil? Why is there so much suffering in the world? This is not true for truly dark, mustache-twizzling, absolute sinister malevolence, but a whole lot of human suffering. right, is simply the gap between our needs, values, and time frames. Meaning, I'd like satisfaction in my lifetime, not 17 generations downstream, right? And the unfolding of the creative destruction of the evolutionary engine. So it's one thing to kind of get all philosophical and be like, oh, but after forest fires, there's green shoots and flowers. You know, it's like you tell that to somebody whose house is burning down, right? And is there a point? Is there a point to this? Or are we just endless grist for the mill? Right? If you think of that rags to riches story, the triumphal progressive narrative, there's always been a point to Western Civ. It's getting better all the time. Right? I think a lot of people are seriously interrogating the fact that any civilization that is barely 250, 350, 500, depending on how you count, years old, and is self-terminating, probably doesn't have a whole lot of claim to the final word on anything. I mean, seriously, right? And that's starting to percolate, right? People are like, what the fuck? We need a redo. So is there a point? And I think this is my best supposition at this point. Bruce Damer and I have been having conversations around this. This was actually our core philosophical question, which is, if there is this endless cyclicity to life, if it is forever just churning along, does time have an arrow? Does it have a direction? Are things getting better? What's the role of complexity in relationship to all of this novelty? And I think that at its best, you could say it is recursively accretive, which means it's forever doing loop-de-loops, right? And just gaining a little bit each time. And just gaining a little bit each time. And we'll unpack that in a sec. And then finally, how do we have hope for the future? And I think the simplest answer is through myth, through story, through ritual, through community. We cannot do this as potted plants, right? If you think about, you go to the hardware store and you find your ficus and it's got a tiny clumped root ball cut off from everything else, shrouded in a plastic tub. That's not how we're supposed to live, right? We take our stand in a stand in the forest. Our roots, our mycelial networks connect and communicate. We support each other. We cannot do this as isolated, rational, deconditioned consumer zoo animals. It will destroy us. We're not built for this shit. But tribe and interconnected community, intergenerational interconnected community is built for this. And as we just saw this morning, as we'll continue to see throughout this conference, right, indigenous peoples, fourth nation peoples, right, those without a state, the Uyghurs, the Romas, the Kurds, the Tibetans, almost all First Nations who experienced removal to reservations, those folks have been practicing this for generations upon generations. How do we carry the flame? How do we keep it alive? Even if in our lifetimes it doesn't look that good. How do we do things on behalf of our children's children's children, instead of just getting in a snit and pulling a Karen and wanting to talk to the manager? So in sum, you can make a case that all of evolution is just that notion of eating starlight in service of generating novels, and that all of human history, right, this is a somewhat novel thing we've done, right, can be defined by our quest to heat star stuff, aka access increasing stores of carbon in service of generating complexity. This is all we do. These are the three elements in our atmosphere. We metabolize oxygen, right? We catalyze carbon, and in all forms of agriculture and horticulture, we concentrate nitrogen. Think back to all those funny stories of explorers in bat caves in guano. You're like, what was that about? You're like, it's nitrogen. The Haber-Bosch process that was first used to fuel Nazi rockets, that then quickly got adopted to produce ammonia and juice our entire global agricultural production, nitrogen. So this is what we do with the elements in our atmosphere. I told you I was an anthropologist from space. All right, that's it. That's it. This is the game at a very fundamental level. So let's take another look. Next, please. So this is from Alfred Korzybski, right? General Theory of Semantics, one of Robert Anton Wilson's key influences. If you don't read Robert Anton Wilson. I'd super duper encourage it. Never mind Illuminatus. That was just a stony bullshit science fiction book for a prank, which became QAnon, which was not a prank. Bizarre, right? Like, Illuminatus was Q with a nod and a wink and a doobie, and Q somehow lost all sense of humor and took it literally. You're like, that's ludicrous. But anyway, I would highly encourage Prometheus Rising and the Cosmic Trigger books. If you want to get deep into Bob's work, that's probably some of the most helpful and insightful. Particularly because the psychedelic movement these days is being ruined by millennials who have paid no fucking attention to the pathways of the baby boomers, their parents, of course, Natch, and are going for earnest and literal magical thinking. And the trickster prankster element that Bob and then late stage Leary did with his 8 neurobiological circuits and that whole model, as well as reality tunnels, as well as the whole prankster trickster nature of things, I think is a far, far healthier epistemology than the overly sincere Instagram shamans and law of attraction fuckwits. All right, we're among friends, we're in the trust tree, right? All right. So anyway, Korzybski has this very interesting 3-part model, and he's basically like, this is what happens on Earth. So he's like, plants bind light. And they do that through the power of photosynthesis, as Wade was speaking about last night, right? Photons plus carbon dioxide plus a smidge of H2O, and you get carbon sequestration. Literally, the plant grows cellulose walls. It creates itself, right? It holds on to the carbon, and it gives back the oxygen. Lungs of the Earth. Beautiful. Then animals bind space through metabolism. We can move around. So we're not just rooted in place, right? And we can move for niche adaptations and habitats. And if you take a look at this, we go from just growing, harvesting photons to actually being able to consume the byproducts, right, of photosynthesis. So now we have horses eating grass. Amazing. And you can also understand that metabolism, our little puny metabolism, doesn't get us very far. Has anybody ever done natural building workshops like Cobb or Straw Bale or any of those kind of things? And you look around at the historic square footage of homes, they're tiny. They're like 400 square feet, 600 square feet. Why? Because moving all that mud around is a pain in the ass. And long after your groovy workshop friends have disappeared for the summer and winter is coming in fast, you're like, we gotta close this son of a bitch up and get a wood stove in there. And you shrink your project accordingly, right? Moving stuff, or anybody live, whether in interior BC, right? Any in the Nelson Kootenays, you come to appreciate a gasoline-powered snowblower, don't you? You're like, you try shoveling that driveway, right? Every other day, right? For 6 months. So you realize, metabolism is hot, which then explains why clever little monkeys like us were like, that sucks, I don't want to do it all. So now we're going to domesticate animals. We're going to convince dumb animals, quote unquote, to help us do our work for us. Oxen, horses, still to this day, our marker of effort, horsepower. But it also explains the evolution of slavery, right? This sucks, this is hard, we need more muscles and I don't want them to be mine. It also explains our relentless hunt for ever denser carbon, right? And the entire Industrial Revolution. And then we'll get to this in a second, what we humans have done. Because we've gone beyond simply the metabolism of our lifetime, and we now bind time. And we bind time through culture. How many of you know how to rub 2 sticks together to start a fire? Yeah, a smidge. How many of us would still be here if we all had to figure that shit out by ourselves? Right? We stand on the shoulders of giants and midgets, but we stand on them. Right? We are all that much better because of the accumulated wisdom of our past, of our ancestors. We haven't had to figure this all out from scratch each time. And if we did, we would be broke ass and cold. But now we also do something else with time. Not only do we bind time from the past, lately we've been borrowing from the future. And we've been doing it in some pretty concerning ways. Number one is, think about the entire carbon boom, right? 1800, let's roughly say. until now, we found a way to stick straws in the ground and set dinosaurs on fire, right? And it's been a wild-ass, super fun ride, right? But that was hundreds of millions of years of buried photosynthesis, concentrated, and now liberated in the internal combustion engine. So we are burning down something that is not renewable in the sense that it took far, 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 far longer to generate than it is to dissipate. We're doing the same with aquifers, right? Most of our aquifers were charged over the span of, since the last ice age, 10 to 15,000 years at a minimum, some of them even longer. And we're just sucking them up. So now, with the borrowing from the past buried starlight, this is weird, right? Because we would think that we are in some enlightened 21st century era, right? Where slavery is a thing of the past, or at least universally frowned upon if and where it ever shows up. And instead, all we've done is we've traded enslaving fellow humans in real time for enslaving future humans with our carbon debt. One of our colleagues who works in the energy space, existential risk and energy, has basically put some numbers to it. And this is crazy. There's roughly 8 billion of us right now. We are enjoying the equivalent human effort of 500 billion people. And the tab is getting kicked to our grandchildren. It's mind-boggling. So I put this in here, there's more context to this, but this came from David Attenborough's, one of his recent Netflix specials. I think it's called Breaking Boundaries. I think that's the one, if anybody remembers. That's like 60 minutes long. It's not the normal like fluffy pandas and pretty butterflies. It's with the Potsdam Climate Institute, and it's like, here are the climate boundaries, here's where we are in them. And he showed this slide, and it just boggled my mind. If you can't, I'll explain it, but the whole like stock market EKG up and down is the past 100,000 years. And the temperature gradient, on the y-axis is plus or minus. Basically, we went up and down, the climate fluctuated, plus or minus 10 degrees Celsius every decade. It was all over the map. So all you could do, the only solution to that kind of climate instability was hypermobility. You were a nomad. You went where the climate suited your clothes. You were always on the move. That was the jam. And then, right, look at that little arrow, right? Look at that, it just goes beep, and then flat lines. And that's us for the last 10,000 years. Plus or minus 1 degree for 10,000 years. You're like, Jesus, that is an anomaly. I mean, look at that. And now we're getting a little wigged about 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. So just to acknowledge, so when everybody says, we were hunters and gatherers for ages and ages, and then, ta-da, 10,000 years ago, we decided to get serious about this thing. That's why. That's how. And it's almost never included in our stories. And this one is a deceptive chart, because if you look at the x-axis, it looks like a nice, clean logarithmic scale, but it's not. It's actually an insanely, ridiculously steep hockey stick. Right, look at the bottom. 100,000 years ago, there were roughly 100,000 people bouncing around this big planet. That's it. Then 10,000 years ago, we're up to 4 million. Interesting. Still lots of elbow room. Right? Roughly, birth of Christ, 500 BCE, right around 100 million. So that's the era of Greece and Rome, right? Early Christian stuff, all the kind of stories we've heard. And then it takes all the way until 1800 to get to our first billion. Then we turn coal into steam engines. By the way, the first steam engines were to pump out flood water from mine shafts for us digging more of that buried star stuff. So our whole impetus, right, has been concentrated carbon, harnessing star stuff. The hotter we can make our fires, the more we can smelt. We go from stone to bronze to iron to steel to silicon to nuclear atoms. Hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter. Right? That's our jam. And you look at that, and you look at just 1800. This is where Thomas Malthus comes on the scene. He's like, oh, whoa, hey, unlimited population growth on a limited planet probably isn't going to pencil out, friends. And everyone's like, ooh, and then Paul Ehrlich's like, scary in the 70s, and everyone's like, fuck you, neoliberalism, more. And then and we go from the 70s to now on this giddy ride where we were convincing ourselves that we could have it all. All of modern economics, whether it's Marx to Milton Friedman to Keynes, all of it is based on the back of this crazy carbon boom where we stuck straws in the ground and set all those dinosaurs on fire and quintupled, 10x'd anything resembling a steady state population for humanity. So all of modern economic and political theory, anything that's happened from the late 19th century through today pretty much, right, is literally like doing a physical stress test on a college kid who scored an 8-ball for the weekend. And he's just been bumping lines all weekend. We're like, our interview, how are you feeling? I feel fucking great. How's your heart rate? It's just thumping out of my chest. How strong do you feel? I could bench press a Volkswagen. And you're like, that's not, actually, I don't think that's really the sustainable answer there, bro. So just to really think, I mean, back to kind of our stories dropping out, you're like, man, we don't know anything. We have been winging it. Right? Because this is not going on forever. So the question, this goes back to, is time an arrow or is time a circle? Are we going someplace? Are we getting someplace? Does this turn out well in the end? Or are we just endlessly grist for the mill? The first is the dude. The dude just abides. Right? That is no time. That is achronic, without time. That's Buddha field consciousness. Interesting, right? We might glimpse it from time to time, but not really particularly relevant for doing the culture thing. The next one, synchronic, means one time, or the deep now. This is kairos. These are flow states, peak states, mystical states, whatever you would say. These are the places where monkey mind goes quiet and we feel that past, present, future are united, right, in some singular spot. Really meaningful, quite powerful. All sorts of good stuff happens there. Diachronic, past, beginning, middle, end, alpha, omega, times arrow. This is how Western civilization has been built. Right? If you think about the synchronic, this is often indigenous cultures. Right? This is seasonal. It comes around, it goes around. There is no place to go. There is nothing to do. We've been here forever. We will remain here forever. Right? But then time's arrow came into the mix, right? Largely with the Judeo-Christian tradition. It was the instantiation of the omega point that connected the dots from a now to a next. And then finally, the polychronic. What does it mean to not simply be lodged in one time frame or scale to the exclusion of the others? What does it mean to hold them all loosely and use them as lenses? Wave or particle, it depends. Depends on how we collapse this. What I'd like to do is now is focus on the middle two. Because if we can focus on the middle two, and we can integrate these skillfully, we get kind of the bonus round as we get promoted to polychronic, quantum acrobats. Right? Holding past, present, future in its intersubjective fluidity. Anybody remember Ptolemy? He's the first century Alexandrian astronomer. We remember this from high school. He had the geocentric notion of the universe. Of course, everything revolved around the Earth, but there was this pesky little problem that there were these really bright stars, aka Venus and Mars and the other visible planets, that refused to stay in place. And they did these ridiculous loop-de-loops around the sky. And he's like, what the fuck is that about? And he's like, okay, epicycles. We're just going to build this into our model that those guys do something very strange, and they go and they do the loop-de-loops. Then, of course, once we realized with Copernicus and Galileo and everybody else that it was the sun, not the Earth at the center, Ptolemaic epicycles, right, the loop-de-loops, in fact, yeah, those kind of went away, and the planets were revealed to be making very sane, conventional orbits around the sun. So Ptolemy might have been wrong about astronomy, but he might have been right about time and whether it's circular or linear, right? Because check this out. Is it possible, and again, hopefully, Bruce, I would imagine you'll be speaking to some of your elements here, and I'm going to be explicitly describing some of Bruce's research briefly here, that this forever boom bust, this forever creating of novelty, this forever overproducing and then plowing it under into compost for the next lap, right? Nonetheless leaves those little yellow dots, leaves those little high watermarks. And is it possible that the linear description of the Western progress is actually just connecting those dots? So we can see, this is what I meant about, is it possible that time and progress is both cyclical, right, forever spinning, and accretive and recursive? And it's those high watermarks that gives us the illusion of linear progress when in fact, right, this is Kali all the way down. So we have this illusion. This is really interesting. I just read this. It was an article in Scientific American last week, which was talking about, it was near where the Lucy skeletons were done, early hominids, and there's a fascinating place in Africa where there's like different fossilized footprints of co-arising early hominids. And the answer, like, in fact, right, we all know this, some version of that meme, right? It's a bumper sticker. Sometimes he's holding an iPhone. Sometimes he's at a desk at the end, right? But that, too, looks linear, right? But the new research is showing that actually when there were half a dozen different types of hominids before those murderous Homo sapiens wiped the rest out, right? They did all kinds of different walking. Some walk like this, some walk like that, some did heel-toe strikes, some actually stood like hanging out in trees. And it was not just a simple progression, right, of hunched to erect to hunched, right? It was all over the place. There was sporadic mutations, innovations, explorations. Some stuck, some didn't, right? And the same with this one, right? Yuval Harari in his book Sapiens, right, just does this very sloppy anthropological story of 10,000 years, everything goes tits up. Right? But if anybody read Dawn of Everything, David Graeber, anybody? Raise your hand if you did. It's a good book, you should. Right? He's completely upended that. He's like, hey, actually, that little story of linear progress to grain storage to slavery to priest class to bureaucracies to patriarchy to the whole sort of suite of ills. He's like, look, man, what about Göbekli Tepe in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey? That shit's 13,000 years old, and best we can tell, it was done by hunter-gatherers. And they built a city which really just turned out to be their permanent party Burning Man camp. They just got together seasonally and left their art cars and their sculptures. So you're like, whoa, wait a second, what? And then throughout history, he traces, he's like, hey man, centralized, hegemonic, down, tops down kind of stuff. That's not always how it's been. We've been forever trying these different things, discarding these different things, right? Much more those cycles, right? Not the line. So are we good? Are you guys doing okay, by the way? Is this all tracking decently? All right. I mean, my hope is I just give you something to think about on your next acid trip. All right. So here's the deal with this novelty thing, right? We've been talking about it. We've been talking about novelty engines, boom-bust cycles, all this kind of stuff. But let's actually kind of unpack it into some more detail. So the first level of novelty creation is literally boom-bust. Fission, fusion. And I don't think I could possibly steal Bruce's thunder on this one, but this is, Bruce and his research partners really pioneering research on the origins of life, going beyond thermal vents in the ocean all the way to hot springs, and that's Fly Ranch Geyser, right, part of the Burning Man community up in Nevada, and it's literally that the hot springs of life created complex life. And it's not just that they were all just kicking it in the tub. It was fission fusion. It was heat getting together, lipids and polymers and bop, 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 and then cooling, separation, isolation, and then connectedness, and then isolation, and then connectedness, and then isolation. And it was that backing and forthing, right, that fission and fusion that then generated more novelty. And Bruce and I were having a conversation. He said that line. He said, death writes the code of life. It is overproduction, winnowing, and selection, right? That is how things progress forward. And then out of this, think back to Korzybski and plants binding light, right? Black sludges learned how to lick sunlight. Oh my God, amazing. And we took photons from the nearest star and got busy. So that's level one, and this is true, by the way. Fission fusion, the big insight I had was reading 10 years ago, what's his bucket? Harold Bloom. No, Howard Bloom. I always get him confused. Harold is at Yale, dead now, and Howard is another interesting writer, and he wrote a book called The Genius of the Beast. And The Genius of the Beast is all about capitalism. And he made that point. He said capitalism is a novelty engine. Capitalism is boom and bust. Capitalism is no different than algal blooms or galaxies and stars being birthed, right? It is a very efficient novelty engine, which is why it keeps propagating. But we, humans, have assigned moral value to the bust cycles. We say greedy robber barons and fat cats. We see all the creative destruction, and we perceive it as a moral failing. And there's plenty of moral failings, make no mistake. This is not absolution for the fat cats, right? But it is to say, understand the drivers and the mechanisms. Understand why capitalism propagated in the way it did. Once we understand that it is in fact just an exquisitely tuned, ruthless novelty engine. Boom, bust, boom, bust. We wouldn't have had, not that this seems like a sad thing at this point, but we wouldn't have had Facebook and Google and Twitter if we hadn't had the dot-com crash of 2001. All that fiber optic cable got laid. We wouldn't have had Christianity if there hadn't been the fall of the Roman Empire with all of the roads and the networks of communications around the Mediterranean. Right? We wouldn't have had European colonialism and expansion if it hadn't been for the Black Death decimating 1/3 of Europe's population. Right? Time and time again, right? Boom, bust. Death writes the code for life and what's next. So this is level 2. And this is the constructural law of fluid dynamics, which basically says, why is it that neurons and galaxies and lungs and trees all look remarkably the same? Right? Everybody's tripped out on that one before. Right? Probably second only to why do dogs have ridges on the palate of their tongue and clouds look scuddy the same way and river bottoms or ocean bottoms have the same, or washboard roads. You're like, what's that about, right? But other than that, it's this one. Branching. Branching. Branching is the most efficient way to explore niches that are underexploited. That's why it's the most efficient oxygen for our capillaries and our lungs. It's the most efficient way for rivers to get from the mountains to the sea. It's the most efficient way for tree branches to expand to harvest photons or roots to pull up water. It's the most efficient way to do what is often called as explore, exploit, niches. But once you've done the first 2 steps, you do the next 2 steps. Once I've explored, branching, and I find something, then I exploit it. And because I've just found an under-competitive niche, I now expand. And I keep expanding until I've over-expanded. And then I expire. And it collapses again. Right? And we can see that. Explore, exploit, expand, expire, death writes the code to life. So we, as a society, I think it's fair to say, are completely fucked up around death. Right? Botox, plastic surgery, hair dyes, Photoshop filters. We cart our elders off to nursing homes to be doped to the gills by total strangers getting paid minimum wage. What the fuck? We are thanatoneurotic. But there's an invitation here, right, of death writing the code to life to become thanatoerotic, to understand that sacred balance. And if we think about the penalties for stiff-arming death, it is pathological and destructive. Look at all the wildfires in the West. We protect property. We've refused to thin. We've stopped First Nations controlled burns. And what do we have now? Crazy amounts of deadfall, full stack blazes that take it all to the ground. We dam rivers. We remove the flood cycles. We collect silt at the bottom of the dams, and that doesn't work anymore. And the beaches and the microhabitats all get flushed out by trying to control the situation. We build dams in New Orleans and Amsterdam to only increase the catastrophic floods when they do come. The more we try and deny death, the more we impinge and deform life. And this is where it gets fun. You get a prefrontal cortex in the spinal column, and you get dopaminergic novelty seeking. So now it's not just boom, bust, boom, bust, boom, bust. It's not even branch, explore, exploit, expand, expire. It's now, what's new, what's next? Right? This is Robert Sapolsky's work at Stanford, The Magic of Maybe, the idea of like if I do my happy dance and I find berries at the end of my little hunting trail as a hunter-gatherer, I get 1 unit of dopamine. Good job, buddy, you got some fructose. But if I'm like, hey, where are all those bumblebees coming from? And I go climb a tree and I stick my hand into the honey patch and I'm like, honey. Right, that's 4x. You get quadruple the reward for the uncertain payoff. Throws sexuality and sexual reproduction, which is massively in favor of more novelty, right? If rather than just a cell duplicating itself, we're now mixing and matching, super novel. Dopamine comes into the mix. Orgasm produces it. It is one of the largest drivers of most of human civilization and most animal kingdoms. But you're like, oh, dopaminergic novelty seeking is another level up the stack of this engine. And then finally, we get to this. What is the arguably pinnacle of novelty generation? Play. Play. Right? It's not even human. Right? As everybody, if anybody's like nerds out like I do on like COVID research, not COVID, Corvid. Ravens, right? Crows. Those sons of bitches, we just keep figuring out they are just as smart as all the First Nation folks have been telling us all along. Tricksy, they can understand language, they can understand logic, I can testify, they can unzip your gear bags in the backcountry and steal your Snickers bars. So play is timeless and not at all the provenance of humans alone. But on the other hand, right, self-aware sentience, choosing, right, via free will to defend this ephemeral complexity, the recursive, accretive high watermarks of each boom and bust. That's the jam. Let's unpack it. And what does that complexity look like in its purest form, right? GTB, the good, the true, and the beautiful. Do we choose to play? Do we choose to play the infinite game? Preserving and protecting. It's not guaranteed. It's not foreordained. Schumpeterian creative destruction waits for us all. We are just grist for the mill unless we choose to bear witness to the good, the true, and the beautiful. And if you want an absolute minimalist philosophy for life, I would propose this is the one act of faith I'm comfortable making personally, right? Which is I choose to believe that a universe with a little more good, true, and beautiful is a better one than a universe with a little less. That's it. That is enough to get me out of bed in the morning. That is enough to put me on the right path. That is enough for me to source from compassion, from kindness, from courage. That's all I need to know. Right? We don't need to know where we come from. We need to know if there's a sky god looking out for us, or there's a happily ever after waiting for us at the end. All we need to choose is that. And this is from Kevin Kelly, right? One of the more heartfelt and grounded futurists of Silicon Valley. He wrote this a while back, but I'll just read it to you, because this to me really helps contextualize that. Is time an arrow? Is time a circle? Is there a point to all this? How do we endure the wound of the world? And he says, here's why it's so hard to imagine an optimistic future. God is 1,000,000 times more difficult to imagine than the devil. We find horror, evil, chaos, destruction, much easier to describe in detail than the details of the good, true, and beautiful. That's because the good and the beautiful are improbable, while the destruction is probable, indeed almost certain. This is the law of entropy. Everything wears down, runs out, breaks down, and levels out into flat sameness. The universe is tilted towards this low bottom, as is our imaginations. On the other hand, ordered living systems are highly improbable. Life may be common in the universe, but every specific example of it is unlikely. Flowers might be common, but this particular species of flower is improbable. You and I are highly unlikely. The universe could roll its dice 1,000,000,000,000 times, and another one of you or I will never happen. And I'll just skip to the end, right? Oh, nope. That is the nature of all good things. They are highly improbable. We need to get better at believing and defending the improbable. Because this is what it comes down to, folks. I would imagine every single person here is here because you've experienced the neck-snapping white light bliss, right? The bliss and the grace of feeling at home and on time, right? And what do we do from that place? The only thing left to do is to open our hearts to the wound of the world. Because if we just chase the light, it will burn us. If we just face the grief, it will crush us. It is at this intersection of Kairos and Chronos, right? The grace of the deep and timeless now and the absolute yoke of this chronological experience of life's a bitch and then we die. And that bearing witness at the beating, bleeding heart of that is arguably cosmic Christ consciousness. We're all drawn to that pulse, that ebb and flow, right? We find it in the groove of music and dance. We find it in the rhythm of powder skiing or surfing, right? We seek it. We love it. We know it. We feel it. It feels like home. But once we found it, what then? And the only credible ethical answer is to bear witness, is to stand up on behalf of our brothers and sisters, the two-leggeds and the four-leggeds, the winged and the finned. Here's this thing. That was all my Anthropologist from space bit. But if it's okay, I'd like to leave you guys with I don't know what to call it. It's called The Poem at the End of the World. And it came through 20 years ago, high up in the Rocky Mountains, in a magical, mystical night that I nearly died in. And I wrote it down afterwards. And it was because I found myself speaking around a fire in rhyming couplets, the story of this tradition. And I reckon most of you will know most of these references, but Ozymandias was a story, it was a poem by Shelley, right, where at the end he says, "Look upon my works, ye mighty in despair." He's a fallen statue of a king, right, who thought he was going to last forever and didn't. And Enoch and Elohim were Old Testament mystics, right? Enoch was the first to get beamed up to the mothership without dying, becomes the lesser Yahweh, Metatron, right? Solomon, right, renowned for his wisdom, but also the keeper of the secret mysteries, and where the Templars find him during the Crusades, right? La Dame du Lac, the Lady of the Lake, right, the one who gives Arthur the sword. 2001, the cosmic child at the end, the black obsidian column that brings consciousness to primates. So I think that's enough. But you get the gist. Or you can keep going. All right. An oft-told tale of far-off lands, bellies of whales, Ozymandias sands. In fact, I'll tell you what, buddy, that's going to be too fast, and I'll just speak it. Can you dim it? Bloop, bloop. Beautiful. I don't want to machine gun you guys, otherwise. All right. An oft-told tale of far-off lands, bellies of whales, Ozymandias sands, whose worn-down face, eroded woe, his fall from grace, a graceless foe, of Solomon, whose temple gleamed of gold and incense more than seemed, a secret quest to gild that lead, the serpent's rise it crowns the head and radiance out, both far and yon, Enoch, Elohim, and Solomon, a secret sect with secret plan to resurrect old Adam man, and sanctify with Kabbalah the sacred cry of Yehovah, of Rastafar and highest I, sing out to Jah, announce the cry, Anthropos rise, perfected man, humble and wise, loves all he can till he's cut down like barley corn, dies in the dark, rise with the dawn, and give to all the sacrifice, Valhalla Hall's unflinching price, to live again and give once more until one then forgives the score. Robin the Hood, the Nazarene, made Marian and Magdalene. Upon the tree, hung up to die, to rise up strong, renounce the lie that we are born to woe and strife, from womb we're torn to brutish life. Forget not hope, that we will find much more than that deep in our mind. The rising tide comes up and up, the sky parts wide. Behold, the cup, the chalice, grail, nectar divine, laughter, wails, and bitter wine. For love of God and good of all, endure the rod, drink down the gall, and so transform that stringent draught. Rework the norm, practice the craft. Like old Crowley, whose debauched ways, if none feel sin, then none need pay, obscured the truths of his occult. That simple rule, do what thou wilt, and it harm none. That is the law, thy will be done, and nothing more. But lawless now, he stands alone. The dark urge pulls. He craves the throne, corrupts the strong, the wise and good. Turns short to long, tangles the wood. For once inside, behind the door, foolish pride craves more and more. The dark nights rise with tainted flow to seize the prize, harness the glow of brightest light and purest sun. On goes this fight, not lost nor won. For when we slip straight through, we'll see that vast expanse, eternity, where time slows down into a trance, where trickster clowns and snares with trance, and once again finds us asleep, too tired to care, too numb to weep. Though if we can, through garden gate, bridge timeless span, eternal wait, we'll gather here, just west of Nod, in Eden fair, home of the gods, and pluck the fruit both sweet and mild of stars that shoot and bear the child. O King of kings and light of lights, our stories sing of mangered nights. Old Lao Tzu, the wizened babe, by living true, all truths unmade, into a joke, a cosmic jest, just up in smoke, forget the rest. And so be free to dance and sing, and so shall we make whole the ring of woven ones and weavers too, and dreamers dreamed right from the blue. By now, we know this story's end. The light of life so fast it bends all space and time to fit the weave, make straight the lines, grow back the leaves, and bring us still back to the start. No sword can kill this radiant heart. Excalibur, unforged, not made, the rosy cross, not rust nor fade. The Knights Templar and Arthur's round searched wide and far, beheld the sound, La Dame du Lac, the sacred bride, the stone she cracked, the sword she'd hide, until the pure, the strong, the wise approach the test, with love will prize the staff of life, lignum vitae, fount of youth, so none need die. All fables point to single place, beyond all laws of Babel's race. The last sutra, diamond of truth, to mighty Jah, the spirit loosed. A column smooth, a prism clear, the star child's womb, end of all fear. And tucked inside, the cosmic babe, humanity's pride, the world will save. Thank you.
nothing to say about that. Unbelievable. My God. Thank you, Jamie. Thanks so much for sharing that.